In October 1307, Paris awoke to the sound of bells ringing and town criers shouting. The same words echoed across the squares. "By order of the king, the Knights Templar are on trial." In the morning, the Knights Templar were still drinking wine from copper cups, but by evening they were already sitting in the dungeons of the Châtelet. The townspeople whispered that they had seen strange rituals in the secret halls of the order. Kissing the charter, renouncing Christ, night gatherings. The rumor spread like wildfire through a dry forest. The more obscene the detail, the faster it passed from mouth to mouth. Friends, I welcome you. This is a story about how rumors become law and morality becomes a weapon. My name is Male Voice, and you are on a channel where we talk about the dark side of history. Right where you are watching from, France, Ukraine, Poland, Italy. It will be interesting to know. Make yourself comfortable and enjoy listening. When Philip IV, known as the Fair, took the throne, the French treasury was already on the brink. Wars with England and Flanders had ruined the treasury. Silver had disappeared from coins, and creditors, including the Order of the Temple, were demanding repayment of loans. The Templars owned land, ports, banks, stored the gold of monarchs and merchants, and held castles from the Pyrenees to Syria. Formally, they were warriors of the faith, but in essence, they were the financial system of Europe. The king depended on them, but wanted their place. The first step was preaching. Church orators hinted that the order had lost its purity. In a tavern on Rue Saint-Jacques, Parisian shopkeepers discussed how the order's charter required new recruits to kiss the idol. No one had seen this idol, but everyone knew someone who had heard from a monk. A month later, the same words appeared in the Inquisitor's reports. On the night of the arrest, more than 140 knights were seized at once. Witnesses said that the guards read a list of pre-written orders, as if counting property. No one knew the charges. They were announced later. Apostasy, idolatry, lewd vows. Behind each point lay a single goal: to damage their reputation. The first confessions were obtained quickly. Under torture, the Templars said the same thing, that they kissed the charter and spat on the cross. But the words were repeated as if dictated. Stenographers and notaries recorded the formulas. Identical, neat, as if copied. Lawyers who studied the protocols a century later found dozens of copies with identical errors in Latin endings, a sign that the text had been prepared in advance. The myth of immoral rituals proved to be the perfect smokescreen. While the townspeople discussed the depravity of the monks, royal officials sealed the order's chests. By order of the treasurer, Guillaume de Nogaret, all the estates were inventoried, and the lists of property were entered into books under the heading Royal Custody. They included land, mills, monastery courtyards, grain warehouses, and, most importantly, silver, weighing more than 50 tons. No other process in that era was accompanied by such detailed accounting. While torture was taking place in the basements, a spectacle was unfolding in the streets. Priests spoke of ritual kisses as a proven fact. The crowd demanded purification of the faith. Blacksmiths dropped their hammers to watch the mutilated prisoners being led to trial. People did not know that the investigation was not conducted according to the rules of canon law. The trial proceeded without the defendants or their lawyers. The archives contain a short document, a letter from the papal legate in Avignon. The testimonies are similar, like letters from the same hand. This is an admission of doubt. Even the church understood that the confessions were too convenient. But to revoke them would mean admitting that the king was a thief, and that was more dangerous than heresy. The royal accounting records show a chronology of coincidences. A week before the arrests, an order was received by the Treasury to recalculate the costs of the war. 2 weeks later, the first transfer of funds from the order's estates took place. A month later, the mint issued new gold florins bearing the image of Philip and the inscription, Restaurator Fidei, Restorer of the Faith. Thus, piety became currency. The locals discussed how the order burned candles with black fire, and how the knights kissed not a cross, but an idol in the form of a cat. These details had no sources. They appeared in the protocols simultaneously in different cities, exactly according to the list. When one of the inquisitors later admitted that he had copied from a common template, it was too late. The order had already been declared defiled. Economics and morality became intertwined. Each denunciation was accompanied by the confiscation of property. No one was held accountable for false testimony. The king had granted indulgences to all participants in the investigation in advance. In such a system, lying became profitable. Rumors of torture even reached the monasteries. Chronicles tell that some knights were kept without light or water and forced to stand for days on end. But the most frightening thing was that their words became law. If a person repeated the formula, his signature was considered evidence against others. Thus, a chain was built from confessions, where each link accused his neighbor. By the end of the year, almost the entire order in France was under arrest. Behind the facade of a religious court lay a financial operation of unprecedented scale. Royal notaries counted coins as clerics count sins. Their reports contained the following lines: "By order of His Majesty, property has been seized for the good of the faith." While bones were being broken in the dungeons, the balance of Europe was being broken upstairs. Nothing remained of the continent's largest banking institution, except rumors of kissing the charter. After the first interrogations, the process acquired the rhythm of a machine. Templates of testimonies came from Paris, and the inquisitors on the ground simply inserted the names and titles of the commanderies. Knights who had recently been respected for their discipline and severity now inspired terror. Their symbol, a red cross on a white cloak, became a sign of shame. Amulets against the curse of the temple were sold on market stalls. The king achieved what his enemies in the East had failed to do. The order was broken not by the sword, but by the pen. Legally, the case looked like a religious investigation. But behind the scenes, a team of treasurers and lawyers was at work. They checked property inventories, weighed jewelry, counted wine and grain, and drew up maps of the estates. In some provinces, the order owned entire villages. After the arrest, the owners disappeared. The property was transferred to temporary management. No one specified that the temporary period would last forever. Pope Clement V initially tried to resist. In letters to Avignon, he wrote that the order was subject only to the Holy See. But that same month, the French army was standing outside his windows. He had to recognize the arrest as legitimate in the name of order. At the Council of Poitiers, it was decided to conduct their own investigation, but by that time, the royal inquisitors had already presented hundreds of confessions. To revoke them would mean invalidating the confiscation decisions, and thus returning the gold. No one was going to do that. A letter from one notary has survived, in which he complains that he has to rewrite confessions 10 times in the same sense. In essence, the protocols were created retroactively. Each document was intended to reinforce the picture of debauchery and heresy. Of the 70 confession formulas, 30 were repeated verbatim. The only difference was in the names. Philip the Fair used everything. In his sermons, he presented himself as the savior of the faith, and in his office as the restorer of finances. On coins and medals, he was depicted wearing a crown with the inscription Purus Fidei. Gold extracted from the Templars' coffers was minted under this inscription. Thus, piety and metal coincided in value. The Paris prison became a factory of repentance. Prisoners were divided into groups. Some were beaten, Others were promised pardon. The strongest broke first, not from pain, but from meaninglessness. Those who remained silent died of hunger. Confessions were written on rolls of cheap paper because parchment was too expensive for mass production. Torture, confession, signature, and the names of new defendants. The chain closed in on itself. When the first documents reached the city cathedrals, they began to be read from the pulpit. People listened with their mouths open. The knights who guarded the Holy Land seemed to have sworn allegiance to the devil. No one asked why they did it. Faith in sin proved stronger than logic. The crowd demanded new arrests. The chronicles contain records of how a crowd in Normandy ransacked the house of a former Templar, confident that they would find an idol there. All they found was a chest with account books. No one was interested in papers with numbers on them. But it was in these books that the real reason for the drama lay. They contained the names of debtors. Among them were royal ministers, merchants, and even monasteries. Everyone owed money to the order. By destroying the creditor, the king got rid of the entire country's debts. A year after the trial began, most of the knights admitted their mistakes. Their testimonies were read out at the cathedral in Paris. But when torture was abolished, some of them recanted their statements. They claimed that they had been forced to incriminate themselves. The king then ordered the interrogations to be repeated, but without the Inquisition, the power of the law gave way to the power of the throne. It was not a purge of heretics, but a demonstration of absolute power. While the monasteries prayed for purification, the treasury's coffers grew. Treasury reports show that in the first 2 years of confiscations, so much silver was collected that the mint had to be expanded. At the same time, spending on the army and the court increased. Not a single penny went to charity, even though that was the slogan used to justify the confiscations. By the middle of the 13th year, the process was no longer a secret. All of Europe knew that the order was doomed. But at the same time, letters were arriving from other kings, asking for a share of the property. England, Aragon, Naples, everyone wanted a piece of the former wealth. Thus began a diplomatic trade, where chests and lands were exchanged under the guise of faith. Contemporary accounts reveal a strange contradiction. The louder the accusations of immorality, the quieter the calculations. Philip's treasury created France's first centralized accounting system. Where people talked about demons, there were tables of interest rates. Under the guise of purifying the soul, a modern financial system was born. Pope Clement V tried to soften the blows. In his letters, he asked that torture not be used without the consent of the court, but these words were lost among the reports. One of them states explicitly, "The evidence must be the same for the people to believe." Fear, clothed in instruction. At the end of 1308, the king decided to hasten the end. It was officially announced that the order had been abolished and its property transferred to the Hospitallers. But by the time of the transfer, almost nothing remained. The castles were occupied by the king's men, the money had been distributed, and the accounts had been cleared. The charter, which they had sworn to preserve, burned along with the archives. Instead of knights, a legend remained about a kiss, betrayal, and execution. Preachers eagerly repeated it because it was convenient. It explained why wealth had changed hands. God himself had taken it away from sinners. The papers do not argue. They were signed amid cries. When the flames first broke out on the island of Set, the crowd did not immediately understand who was being executed. People saw only 2 figures in gray shirts and iron chains. They were Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, and Geoffroy de Charny, commander of Normandy. They walked silently, without resistance. The chronicles say that their faces were burned and dried out by years of imprisonment. Witnesses claimed that before their death, they denied their confessions, but the clerks standing at the scaffold recorded otherwise, that everything they confessed is the truth. Even the last minute was turned into a protocol. Paris buzzed like a beehive. Some cried, some shouted, "Glory to the king!" Tax collectors stood nearby, watching as smoke hid the bodies of those who had once guarded the gold of Europe. The wind picked up the ashes, and it seemed that it was not the order that was burning, but the very concept of trust. No one knew whom to trust anymore: God, the king, or the notary. Philip the Fair achieved absolute victory. He not only destroyed the debt, but also reinforced the idea of the monarch as the judge of faith. After the execution of the magistrate, a series of reforms began. A new council of lawyers was created, subordinate only to the throne. From that moment on, the concept of state investigation became the norm. Where church approval had previously been required, the royal seal was now sufficient. But with victory came a shadow. The economy did not revive. The gold confiscated from the Templars disappeared into the bottomless expenses of the court. The new coinage quickly depreciated. The mints could not cope with counterfeiting, and there was nowhere to get loans. No one wanted to repeat the fate of the order. France was left without bankers and without trust. Pope Clement V died a month after the execution. His successor, John XXIII, did not touch on the subject. It was easier to remain silent than to admit that faith had become a tool of the Treasury. In his letters to the bishops, he wrote only about the need for caution in interrogations. But these words sounded like an excuse, not repentance. Doubts began to arise among the new generation of lawyers. One of them, Pierre Dubois, wrote in a treatise on the state that a confession obtained under threat of pain is not the truth. It was a tiny crack in the monolith of fear. A century later, such formulas would become the basis for reforms of the judicial process. But at that time, it was just a whisper in an empty hall. Documents found centuries later show that the royal chancelleries treated the case as a financial transaction. Each estate of the order was described in 10 columns: the number of peasants, mills, herds, and grain reserves. In some cases, they even indicated the average income for the past decade. The word heresy does not appear once in these tables. All accusations of debauchery served as a cover for accounting. In the popular imagination, history quickly turned into myth. At fairs, people said that the Templars worshipped the golden head of Baphomet, that the order's castles still hid cursed silver. People searched for treasure, but found only empty cellars. The rumors were convenient for the authorities. They distracted from the question of where the real treasure had gone. Documents clearly show that most of the silver was used to pay off debts to the king's own courtiers. The rest went to the war with Flanders. 5 years later, all the gold for which hundreds of people had been burned disappeared into ashes. The only legacy left behind was new methods of control. The judicial system changed. After the Templar trials, the procedure for the use of torture began to be recorded. Now, written permission from a judge and the presence of witnesses were required. Formally, this looked like humanism, but in reality, it was the legalization of violence. For the first time, France codified what had previously been done in the shadows. In monastic schools, young novices studied the example of the Order of the Temple as a lesson in repentance and obedience. In illustrations accompanying the chronicles, the Templars were depicted with their hands tied, kneeling before the king. The artists did not know that in reality, the interrogations took place without witnesses and without trial. The image replaced the document. Thus, the memory of people was turned into an educational picture. At the beginning of the 14th century, former brothers of the order who had escaped dissolved into the cities of Italy and Germany. Some became mercenaries, others became bankers, hiding their origins. No one mentioned their names. It was beneficial for the authorities that the legend of the sinful knights lived longer than the truth. Every rumor reinforced the moral monopoly of the throne. But doubts also arose within the court. The chronicles of the court physician report that Philip the Fair himself complained of dry heat and burning visions shortly before his death. His contemporaries considered this a sign of a curse, but it may have been a common stroke. He died suddenly, leaving the country with debts and without heirs who would be as respected as he was feared. Historians would call this the end of the era of belief in violence. After the demise of the order, France began to wonder for the first time where the line between law and will lay. But at that time, these words were spoken too quietly. As long as people believed in kissing the charter, no one asked who was counting the coins. A few decades later, chroniclers would write that no one could light a fire on the site of the Grand Master's pyre. The earth supposedly rejected the flames. This would become a new legend, a reflection of fear. People would come to look at the empty space and whisper that the smoke of the order still hung over Paris. Meanwhile, in the royal archives, pages with descriptions of property would dry, each line representing the price of a human life. Thus, religious truth became an accounting formula, and faith became a document with a seal. After the destruction of the Order of the Temple, Europe was unable to recover for a long time. Fear of being accused of heresy paralyzed initiative. Monastic orders avoided financial affairs, merchants hid their profits, and priests shunned wealthy patrons. It seemed as if the very idea of accumulation had become suspect. The idea took root in people's minds. Wealth was a harbinger of sin, and success was a reason for interrogation. A special department was created in the French Chancellery to ensure the purity of spiritual institutions. Some of its reports have survived. Tables, dates, amounts, names, the same schemes that had been used against the Templars were now applied to others: the Hospitallers, the Benedictines, and merchant guilds. Arrests were no longer carried out with fanfare, but quietly at night. People had become accustomed to the idea that any secret could be grounds for denunciation. But time inexorably turned fear into skepticism. By the middle of the 14th century, when a new generation had come of age, the first writings began to appear in which the tragedy of the order was seen not as divine retribution, but as a state conspiracy. Scholars in Bologna and Naples, working with copies of documents, discovered inconsistencies in dates, signatures, and locations. One of them noticed that several confessions used the same scribe's handwriting. This discovery caused a sensation among lawyers. Thus began the rehabilitation of reason. Historians now call this the first attempt at judicial criticism of sources. At the time, it seemed like audacity. To question the verdict was to question the infallibility of the monarch. But the new lawyers already lived in a world where power had to be explained, not simply asserted. And in this world, the name of Philip the Fair sounded different, not as a pious king, but as the author of a banking coup under the guise of holiness. The judicial reforms initiated after the Templar case unexpectedly turned against their creators. The formulas devised to justify torture were now used as evidence of abuse of power. New treatises on the admissibility of pain and truth under pressure were taught at the universities of Paris. Some professors were already writing openly. Torture produces words, not facts. A curious entry has been preserved in the city records of Paris. 40 years after the execution of the Grand Master, local masons refused to work on the reconstruction of the tower where the Templars had been held. It was said that moans could be heard there at night. The townspeople avoided the place. Superstition became a form of memory. The people, unable to read documents, remembered the horror in a different way, through stone and silence. During those same years, the Church quietly revised its attitude toward confessions obtained under torture. One of John Lérithoine's bulls included the clarification: a confession obtained through fear must be confirmed by free will. This legal caveat, insignificant at first glance, changed everything. From that moment on, the investigator was obliged to provide a second hearing without coercion. Formally, this was for the sake of justice. In reality, it was to avoid repeating the mistake that had become the shame of the era. The myth of the Templars continued to live on. Artists depicted them as dark alchemists. Writers invented secret rituals and conspiracies. But behind every myth was a document with figures, and when 15th century humanists found copies of the inventory of property, their excitement turned to shame. The order's income barely exceeded France's annual budget. It was not a monster of wealth, but a neat institution for managing funds. People's fears turned out to be disproportionate to the facts. Meanwhile, a new generation of lawyers was growing up in Europe, educated in the lessons of the order's tragedy. For them, the case of the Templars became an argument in disputes over individual rights. The first arguments appeared that power should be limited not only by morality, but also by procedure. This marked the beginning of the slow path to law instead of faith. But no law could bring back those who had been burned. Even 100 years later, chroniclers still described March 13th, 1314, as the day when the flames consumed not people, but an era. After that bonfire, trust in the word of authority was never the same again. The memory of Jacques de Molay became a kind of test for the conscience of France. His name was not spoken in churches, but it was not forbidden either. It lived on in the margins of chronicles, alongside short notes, pro fide, for the faith, contra fiscum, against the Treasury. These two words sum up the whole story. By the beginning of the 15th century, when Europe was recovering from the plague, new orders, new alliances, and new riches had appeared. But from then on, every time the authorities needed money, they remembered the temple. Its fate became a formula: accusation, confession, confiscation. This was how the machinery of the state worked, having tasted the sweetness of someone else's gold for the first time. The myths about kissing the charter no longer interested anyone. They had served their purpose and become obsolete. What was important was something else: the precedent that had been set. Now any union that became too rich or too independent could be declared sinful. The law, born of fear, continued to operate under the guise of morality. Thus, the shadow of the Paris bonfire stretched over an entire century. In every new trial, from witches to heretics, the echoes of the same formulas could be heard: fear, paper, signature. In the centuries that followed, it seemed that everything had come to an end. The order of the temple disappeared, its property was divided, and the memory was cleansed of facts. But the documents continued to live their own life, slowly, like coal under ashes. The archives of Parisian notaries preserved lists of debts cancelled by royal decree after the burning of the magistrate. These were dozens of pages of numbers. Next to them was a brief note: case closed, debtor released. Thus, economic benefit took the form of salvation of the soul. When 17th century historians began to systematize sources, they discovered strange arithmetic. Before the execution of the order, the national debt was about 6 million livres. A year after the confiscations, it had halved. This meant that the accusation of heresy brought the Treasury more than a decade of taxes. Faith turned out to be a profitable investment. This sums up the whole mechanism of the era: religion as accounting, salvation as a budget item. Gradually, the order became a symbol of a lost ideal. Humanists wrote about it with a touch of romantic regret. Warriors sacrificed to greed. But behind their sentimentality lay a misunderstanding of scale. The Templars were not hermit knights, but builders of infrastructure. They created a system of credit, storage, and roads that connected Europe before the emergence of nation-states. By destroying them, Philip the Fair destroyed not heresy, but the prototype of a banking network. The myth of kissing the charter remained in the chronicles as a strange footnote. No contemporary document confirms the existence of the rituals described. No idols or mysterious rites were found. Only a piece of paper with identical confessions. A forgery reinforced by a signature. But people always believe in images, not numbers. They need a story where the sinner is punished and the saint is rewarded. The truth is too cold to warm the crowd. The death of Philip the Fair became shrouded in legend. A few months after the execution of the magistrate, he fell from his horse while hunting. The people said, "The curse of the temple." The church remained silent, but the chroniclers wrote, "God does not leave without judgment those who judge unjustly." So even the king's death became part of the myth covering up the economy. No one said that the accident would not bring back the gold that had disappeared from the royal treasury. Centuries later, lawyers would call the Templars case the first example of fiscal inquisition, a court where morality serves as a pretext for confiscating property. It was this mechanism that would later be applied to witch trials, Protestant heresy, and the persecution of bankers. The structure is the same. Declare someone vicious, isolate them, confiscate their property. Everything else is just window dressing in the form of sermons and insurance formulas. At the dawn of the Enlightenment, French archivists found several unsigned interrogation sheets in a forgotten folder. In the margins, a 14th century official had written, "The confessions are the same, but the silver is real." These words became an unwitting epitaph for the whole story. They combined irony and horror. Faith in money proved stronger than faith in God. By the 18th century, a new religion had emerged in Europe, the law. Judicial codes restricted the use of torture and required written evidence rather than confessions under torture. No one referred to the purity of faith when confiscating property anymore. But the spirit of the old process lived on in the very principle of power. If an economic goal needed to be justified, an accusation could always be found. Only now, instead of heresy, they spoke of treason, and instead of idols, they spoke of enemies of the state. The form changed, but the logic remained the same. In the 19th century, archaeologists excavated the ruins of a temple in Paris. Under the stone, they found pieces of burnt parchment and ceramics with trademarks. There was no trace of ritual objects, only accounting marks, names, amounts, and routes for transporting silver. Historians called this documentary archaeology of corruption. Even the ashes spoke the language of finance. Modern museums show the process of the Templars as an example of the fusion of politics and morality. On the stands are copies of confessions and reports of confiscations. Above them is the inscription, "Myth versus Document." On the left is an engraving depicting an idol. On the right is a table of the order's income. Between them is emptiness. The viewer falls into this emptiness, realizing that a story about sin is always more convenient than a tax report. Psychologists of the 20th century wrote that the case of the Templars is an example of how collective fear justifies cruelty. People believe that they are destroying evil when in fact they are protecting their own debts. This paradox encapsulates the essence of the era of Philip the Fair. He did not defeat heresy, he legalized cynicism. Today, the name Jacques de Molay is often mentioned in novels and films. His image is the last fire resisting the night. But behind this image lies the quiet tapping of Treasury accountants, whose pens recorded the birth of a new world, where sin is measured in livres and ounces of silver, a world that calls greed reform and theft purification. If you walk along the banks of the Seine near the Palace of Justice, where the fires once burned, the smell of ashes is no longer there. But the air there is strangely heavy, Historians say it's just humidity from the water. Or maybe it's the residual weight of words when lies become official documents. Thus ended the story that began with rumors of kissing the charter. It ended with a new charter, a law on confessions, signed 100 years later. Paper defeated flesh. And only the rare lines of chroniclers remind us that it all began with an empty treasury and a king who was too handsome.